Eco P14 M11. We shall discuss the topic labor markets and their functioning in developing countries. The topic is labor markets and their functioning in developing countries. The market for inputs emerge because there is an imbalance between endowment of these inputs. One such imbalance occurs in the market for land and labor. Distribution of land is unequal. The result is that those who own land, they do not have sufficient labor to cultivate the land. As a result, market for land and labor emerge. In such a situation, market for land and labor emerge in order to balance the distribution of land and labor. Landless laborers and small farmers supply labor to the big landlords who have sufficient amount of land but do not have adequate amount of labor. In this topic, we would like to discuss the markets for labor, various forms of labor, and the functioning of the labor market. In developing countries, there is no single market for labor. Broadly speaking, we shall divide labor into two categories. Labor hired on casual basis, payments are made on daily basis or weekly basis, just as labor employed for harvesting, labor employed during sowing season, and so on. Second type of labor is labor under long period contract. This labor does supervisory work or those tasks which cannot be continuously monitored. In the case of long-term labor, the results of the labor or the consequences of the labor expended on the task occur after a time gap. As a result, it is not possible to observe what has been done by the labor. The employer employ this type of labor for long period analysis because they feel that it will become possible to put the responsibility of failure on these laborers. In the case of casual labor, what we find is the labor is reshuffling over a period of time, and it becomes very difficult to point out who is responsible for deviation. So, for such tasks which cannot be monitored or which require supervisory function are given to the long-term laborers. Standard demand-supply model for labor, which we study in textbooks, is not able to discuss about the labor market in developing countries. Under this demand-supply model, the wage rate is determined at a point where demand and supply are equal. And if anyone is unemployed at the going wage rate, he or she can find a job elsewhere. The employer doesn't have any control on the labor. So this model is inappropriate for developing countries. The reason is that in developing countries, we find involuntary unemployment even at the going wage rate. According to the standard model, if there is an involuntary unemployment, the wage rate should fall. But in developing countries, what we find is that wage rate does not fall, and those who are unemployed or involuntary unemployed, they are actually debarred from working because their work capacity or ability to work is not sufficient in accordance with the wages being paid to them. We shall study the working of the casual labor market in detail. The reason is that in developing countries, 90% or more than 90% of the labor is engaged in informal sector. And out of this 90% labor also, an overwhelming majority of the labor is working in the agricultural sector. Both men and women are part of the labor force. The casual workers are unskilled and poor. They make living by working in the unorganized sector. There is no social security. The wage rates are low. The casual laborers are paid in cash, kind, or in both, because most of them are working in the agricultural sector. Workers engaged in agriculture sector are paid on piece rate basis. It means that they are paid according to the tasks performed by them. Regular long-term work contract take the form of regular farm servants. Usually they tend to livestock and other works allotted by the wealthier landlords. their contract period vary from 3 months to 12 months. They are required to perform different types of tasks. They work in the agricultural sector. They also perform other domestic works and etc. In developing countries, the unemployment rate is significantly high and it varies according to the season. During the peak season, the unemployment rate is low, but during the slack season, the unemployment rate is high. High degree of seasonality in demand, there is high degree of seasonality in demand for labor. Different unemployment rate occur as a result during peak season and slack season. Females are significantly less than men and tasks are assigned according to the sex. Our tasks are sex specific. Demand for labor depends on going wage rate. Lower the wage rate, higher is the demand for labor. Supply of labor is on the basis of cost benefit analysis. Higher the wage rate, higher is the supply of labor. Intersection of demand and supply determine the wage rate. This is the standard model. This model of determination of wage rate is inappropriate for developing countries. The reason is that the model fails to distinguish between casual labor and long-term labor. What happens tomorrow does not depend upon what is happening or occurring today. The model fails to distinguish between the labor power and laborer. Since individual may be excluded from employment in the labor market because their work ability is not sufficient to compensate for the wages which they are getting. Thirdly, the model assumes that work is perfectly monitorable, which is not the reality. There is no such thing as involuntary unemployment in this model. This leaves out a central aspect of reality in developing countries. Rural markets are characterized by substantial uncertainty. The demand for labor varies according to the season. If the rainfall is adequate, then demand for labor is high. Or in terms of the diagram, the demand for labor shifts to the right. On the other hand, if the rainfall is poor, the demand for labor will be low. Or in terms of the demand curve, the demand curve shifts to the left. So we do not have a stable demand curve in the developing countries for labor. Therefore, we conclude that the standard demand supply model for demand supply model is not appropriate or is unable to explain the features of the labor market in developing countries. In order to discuss the features of labor market in developing countries, we shall introduce certain terms which are required to explain the supply of labor. The words are poverty, nutrition. Now, nutrition means what? Basically, we are dealing with the type of food which the laborers eat. Nutrition actually determines the work capacity of the individual. Since the level of nutrition intake depends upon the income, we can use income as a proxy for nutrition. At low level of income, the capacity of the worker is very low. That is to say, at low level of income, the nutrition intake is low. Consequently, the work capacity is low. When the income is increasing, nutrition level is increasing. Yet, in the range of low income, the capacity of the worker does not increase much. After a point, when a threshold is reached, nutrition level increases, or in other words, income increases, the work capacity of the individual increases substantially. Taking into account this fact, what we find is that supply curve of labor by an individual, or the amount of hours supplied by the labor by an individual, if we look at this curve, what we find is that there is a gap in this curve. The reason is that below a certain level, the capacity to work or the number of hours which he can or she can work are very low. After the threshold has been crossed, the capacity to work or the number of hours which the worker can expend on work increase substantially. So in between these 2 points, what we find is that there is a gap. With sudden increase in income, the work capacity increases substantially. Same applies to other laborers. And when we aggregate the supply curve of all the individuals, what we get is that we get an aggregate supply curve which has a gap in it. Now, what we find is that if the demand curve for labor intersects in this gap, we have a very strange situation. Our theory states that if wage rate is above this threshold, then there is excess supply. Consequently, the wage rate will fall and move towards equilibrium. On the other hand, if wage rate is below this threshold, what we find there is excess demand and wage rate should increase. This is applicable to standard demand and supply model. But as we have stated that the demand curve is intersecting the supply curve where there is a gap in the supply curve. This is a very strange situation. What we find is that wage rate cannot decrease below this. The simple reason is that at a lower wage rate, the supply of labor cannot be provided because of the low capacity to work of the workers. So what we find is that at the going wage rate, there is involuntary unemployment, that workers are prepared to work at the going wage rate, but they are not employed because employers find them to be unemployable because their capacity to work is not sufficient. This is one of the features of the labor market that we come across. Lack of labor market opportunities make for low wages, but it is not the fact that only wage rates determine work capacity. A low capacity to work feeds back on a situation by lowering the access to the labor market. A low capacity to work actually leads to low wage rate. There is the vicious circle. Vicious circle is complete in the sense that wage rates are low, which leads to low capacity to work. Low capacity to work in turn leads to low wage rate in developing countries. There is another thing that we can talk about, the supply of labor in developing countries. Those laborers who have assets other than labor also, they are in a position to supply larger quantity of labor. Or in other words, their ability to work or capacity to work is high. Whereas those laborers who do not have any other asset apart from labor, their capacity to work is low. Therefore, what we find is that as wage rates, or in other words the piece rates, in developing countries, the wage rates are actually the piece rates. The wage rates are paid in accordance with the task performed. As piece rates or wage rates increase, the workers are in a position to supply more work because they also have some other non-labor asset. In the case of people who have large amount of land, what we find, they have ability to work, but at different wage rates, their willingness to work is low because they have sufficient amount of income from other sources. In this context, we can talk about the effect of land reforms on the labor supply curve. If land reforms are introduced in developing countries, what are the consequences? There are people who are the losers, there are people who are the gainers. The gainers are the small farmers or landless laborers. The result is that apart from labor, they have another asset in the form of land. As a result, their capacity to work and ability to work increases. Therefore, this leads to increase in supply of labor. On the other hand, the losers are the big landlords. When land is taken from them, their non-labor assets decrease. Consequently, their income from non-labor assets also decreases. As a result, in this situation, they are willing to work at wage rates which are lower than what they were willing to work at wage rates which were higher. When the land is taken from the big landlords, their willingness to work at low wage rates increases because their non-labor income has been reduced due to land reforms. From this, what we conclude, the supply of labor shifts to the right because of two reasons. The landless laborers who have got land now, they have increased their supply of labor. The big landlords from whom the land has been taken, they have also increased the supply of land. Overall result of the land reforms is both of them benefit from it. The nation also benefit from it because of increase in supply of labor, the output of the nation increases. There is another point which is the feature of labor market in developing countries. The question is why the wage rates in developing country are low. If the wage rates are increased, or in other words, if the employers increase the wage rate over a period of time because of better nutrition, the work capacity of the worker will increase, and consequently keeping that worker employed will benefit the employer also. But in reality, the employers do not increase the wage rate. The reason is this, that there is no surety that the worker will continue to work with the employer. Since the labor is casual labor, if high wage rates are paid to him, then in future he may or may not work with the employer. Secondly, there is another chance, if the worker has more capacity, the other employer would like to attract him towards themselves by offering better wages. So the employer finds that there is no surety that the worker will continue to work with him. Consequently, he pays low wage rates to him. The overall result is that the workers get paid a very small amount. They are being paid low wages. The result is that their nutrition intake remains very low. Consequently, their work capacity is low. The employers are also the losers because they are forced to employ workers whose capacity is low, because they do not have any incentive to pay higher wages because of the non-permanence of labor, that laborers are casual laborers. We would like to say a few words about permanent laborers. Permanent laborers are long-term laborers or tied laborers. There are two types of permanent laborers. Laborers who are employed in supervisory capacity, or laborers who are employed for those tasks which are not monitorable. Secondly, workers who perform tasks as those of casual laborers. The existence of first category relies on the fact that the employers have large amount of land, the family labor is insufficient to properly operate the farm. Therefore, for supervisory work and for those tasks which are not continuously monitorable, they need permanent laborers. The tasks which cannot be monitorable depend upon the technology. That we are using technology like looking after the capital equipment, operating the capital equipment, maintenance and proper use of equipment in the agricultural sector. These activities are hard to monitor. As a result, laborers are employed on long-term basis for these work. Now, these workers are employed and they are working with the employer for long-term basis. If they deviate from their work, there is a threat of discontinuance of employment. Now, the threat will be effective only if the laborers employed for long-term work are paid a premium. In other words, they are paid wages which are over and above the going wage rate in the market. The simple reason is that they are paid a premium because if they are fired, they will not be able to get that much money in the labor market. There are long-term workers in casual tasks also. They are employed on long-term basis because it benefits both the laborer and employer. The reason is that the wage rates for casual works fluctuates due to season. During peak season, the wage rates are high. During slack season, the wage rate, or in other words, piece rates are low. In order to smooth the income of the employee throughout the year, some employees prefer to work on long-term basis, and they are employed by the big landlords. The landlords also prefer to employ them on long-term basis because what they find is that they are paying, during the peak season, they pay them lower wage rates than prevailing in the market. Whether this contract of casual work will work in the long run or not, it depends upon two things. The size of gains involved. The size of gains involved while deviating from contract. If the laborers during the peak season, if the laborer finds that he can get large amount of increase in his income at alternative job, then there is an incentive to deviate or leave the employer. Secondly, the question is how easy is it for the laborer or the laborer who is deviating from the contract to find alternative employment as a permanent labor. If alternative sources of permanent employment are available easily, then the probability of deviating from the contract will be high. So both these considerations restrict the incidence of permanent labor of this type. The deviation from the contract will not be there if the difference between wage rate during the peak season and the slack season is not very large. Secondly, if the information regarding deviation from the contract is available to the other employers, in that case, the other employers will not employ these laborers. In less mobile economies, in which flow of information is higher, there is less incidence of deviation from contract. As the country develops, or in the case of developing countries, where the mobility of labor is increasing and their information becomes less easily available, in developing economies where development is taking place fastly, mobility of labor is increasing, getting information becomes difficult, the result will be the incidence of permanent labor will decline. So these are some of the features of the labor market in developing countries. How the labor markets are working in developing countries we have discussed.